This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Patrick Gulo.
I'm Dave McDonald.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And I'm Nate Blyton.
And this week we're joined by composer Tod Machover. Tod is professor of music and media at the MIT Media Lab in Cambridge. Since its founding in 1985, his robot opera Death and the Powers was a 2012 Pulitzer Prize finalist, a piece we've talked about before on the show. This week we'll be talking about a Toronto Symphony being premiered March 9th by none other than the Toronto Symphony. Tod, thanks for being on the show.
Really a pleasure to be here.
So, your pieces have appeared on the show before as news items. As I mentioned before, we talked about Death and the Powers, where we're excited about this a Toronto Symphony project. But first, I thought we'd just start off by talking about you, and especially the MIT Media Lab, which sounds like an incredible place to work and basically have your whole professional life geared around. Could you talk about your role there?
Yeah, so in fact, that's true. I've been at the MIT Media Lab for a while, for over 20 years. And MIT in general is kind of an unusual place because it's not an art school traditionally, and it's actually not a traditional university. It's a place that was designed to combine architecture and design and engineering and aesthetics around the time of the Civil War. And it's always grown up with a very flexible structure, and it's designed for people to make things rather than to study things, although we do study things. The Media Lab is the part of MIT that's devoted to basically making the quality of life better for people through technology, whatever aspects of life that we want to try to affect. So there is a big art and component. There's music and visual and all kinds of things, but there's also education, health, future of bodies. Literally, we have probably the world's best intelligent prosthetics designer at the Media Lab, and so it's a place where literally we rub shoulders with people from very different disciplines who are trying to think about quality and meaning of life. So it's been a great place to work on music. I've been able to kind of follow whatever aspect of music interested me. And since I've always been interested in concert music, but also in how to make music a central part of everybody's lives in as significant a way as possible, we've been able to do things from build hypercellos for Yo-Yo Ma, to make robot operas, to use music for health, to invite the public to collaborate on music making, and really to think of not just a range, but a continuum of music activities. So I'm a professor there. I run a group called Hyper Instruments and Opera of the Future. And basically it's a place to dream big and bring groups of people together to try to realize some of these visions. So I quite enjoy it there.
Patrick was just asking if you could tell us about some current projects you have going out of the Media Lab.
Yeah, so I heard that.
Okay.
Yeah, so the biggest project going on right now at the Media Lab, you mean our projects or just projects in general?
Both.
I see. Okay, well, let's see. Gosh, there's such a range of projects at the Media Lab. So one of my colleagues at the Media Lab, actually the person who I share a big lab space with, her name is Neri Oxman. She's an architect and designer. She's actually married to Osvaldo Golijov, who I bet you know. Neri is interested in the future of design and how nature influences design. So that's partly in the look of design and the aesthetic of design, but also in the materials of design. So two things that she's doing right now are she's making structural materials that are based, instead of on cement and steel, they're actually based on human bone, because bone is a very complex structure that is also very light because it has a lot of air in the bone structure. And so she makes structural columns based on bone. She's also working on large habitable structures that are based on the way silkworms weave structures. So actually in our lab, we've got I think there are about 100 silkworms right now, be several thousand silkworms fairly soon. And believe it or not, the silkworms You can actually give them food to eat that changes their metabolism and actually influences the way they weave. So we have these kind of lattice structures and silkworms walking all over them, spinning webs and making incredible. They're basically rooms or chairs or structures that people can sit in. And actually, one thing that Neri and I are doing together for a place called Le Laboratoire, the lab in Paris for the fall, is we're making a cocoon, which won't be built by silkworms, but is a kind of wooden acoustic room, which is designed for doing vocal experiments, using your voice, having resonance in the room and actually resonance in a chair, which takes your voice and actually amplifies your own vocal vibrations throughout your own body. So that's kind of an example of architecture, design, silkworms, and music together. I have a student right now who came to the Media Lab to work on music and emotion, and she has been doing that, but in fact, she's extremely interested in cuisine. So she's been working on music and food, the influence of audio and frequency in particular on our perception of taste. So she does experiments where you taste the same food, but have headphones on and listen to many, many different kinds of music. And sure enough, things sound quite differently taste quite differently depending on context. And she's designing a big feast for the Media Lab, a kind of interactive feast, a full immersive experience for a couple of months from now. So those are, anyway, the many projects. We're working on a project right now. We're right near the end of it called a Toronto Symphony, because there have been kind of two different paths in my work. One path is to push the future of concert music in terms of the technologies that enable creators to make their work, and then the technology that enables work to be presented on stage to enhance what live performers can do. So that's kind of performed music. And then on the other end, I've been quite interested in using technology to open musical experiences, either performing or listening or creating, to as many people as possible. And in many ways, this Toronto Symphony project is an attempt to bring those two paths together to do a concert piece, which also involves a lot of other people in creating it. And in doing so, I've been interested in trying to make a model which goes beyond crowdsourcing and connects audiences with professional musicians in a way that goes back and forth, that isn't and isn't just collecting things and patching them together, but really is a kind of collaboration.
It's really interesting. Go ahead, Sam.
Aspect of the Toronto Symphony, or a Toronto Symphony, excuse me, that it really intrigued me is using technology to figure out the ways that you can connect people with music, not just with the product that's created, but in the creation of the product. Could you go over some of the specifics of what you actually did, the technology that was involved, starting these collaborations, and maybe lead into, I'm sure, some things you have planned that will go on in the same vein after the product has been created and performed?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick background, Toronto Symphony Orchestra came to me about a year and a half ago. They put on a new music festival every March called New Creations, and each year they have a different curator for the festival. So they asked me if I'd be interested in curating this year's festival, which is coming up, starts next Saturday, March 2nd, and to think about a festival around the future of the orchestra. So I said, of course, that would interest me. And they offered to play a couple of my existing pieces for orchestra and technology, and then asked if I wanted to do a new piece. And I knew that they were a very open-minded, interesting orchestra. I knew some of the people involved, including music director Peter Ungen and artistic director Loie Fallis. And so I decided it was a good context to try out some kind of a bigger idea that would have a chance of being followed through on. So I proposed this idea of writing the symphony and inviting whoever in Toronto wanted to participate to actually collaborate on making the piece. Never done anything exactly like that, but in some ways, the model I had in my head was a bit like the kind of collaborations I put together at the MIT Media Lab. So I'm talking to you today from, this is my barn. I live about 25 minutes away from the MIT Media Lab. The Media Lab is a very modern Fumiko-maki building.
This looks like a Edo period barn. It looks like an Edo period barn.
Yeah. So this is actually a farm in Waltham from about 1790. And so the barn is from the end of the 18th century. It was a kind of a mess when we bought the place, but we've turned it into a music studio. And so I love spending my time out here feeling like I'm pretty far away from anything. But I also really like going to the lab, which is a very open place. And it's a place where I like bringing together a group of people with very different backgrounds for each of my projects. So I can bring together colleagues at a very top of their profession in designers and directors and technologists, but also graduate students who are kind of like apprentices and undergraduates who are maybe 17 or 18 years old and just starting out. And I like putting together these groups and treating everybody literally as an equal to solve problems together. And there's something kind of unique that comes out of a situation like that when everybody's given an equal chance to contribute. And so in thinking about Toronto, I was very interested in scale. Can you invite a lot of different people from really different backgrounds into a process like this to share how to make something?
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask: is this breaking up, or is this okay?
No, it's mostly fine. Yeah.
So can I continue and go back to Sam's question?
Go ahead, please do.
So given that context, my gosh, there was a huge question about how to do this. It's one thing if you have 20 people or even 30 people sitting around a big table. It's another when you're inviting people who you don't know and trying to scale it. So the first thing that I did was to define 3 categories of ways of interacting with whoever participated. One, I called them yours, mine, and ours. And yours were requests that I sent out to the public to say, here's a kind of thing that I'm very interested in for this piece, and if you'd send it to me. So we started out, for instance, by asking for simply stories, audio stories about what brought you to Toronto, about Toronto's voices, talking about things they cared about. Then recording sounds of Toronto, the most typical sound, the sound you like the best, sound you hate the best. If you want to record it or couldn't record it, I asked people to just send me a description. You could go out and record it. And a variety of things like that. That turned into melodies and harmonies, but things I would ask for people. Mine were things that I made and then sent out to the community, either just to get to know or to play with. So, for instance, I started with a chord progression from the piece, a kind of skeleton, and sent that out with a request to write melodies or motivic material around my chords, to take my chords and put interstitial chords in between the chords that I'd made, or to simply riff off the chords and write something else. And for that, I started with professional musicians. In fact, I sent that first to the musicians in the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, not knowing who would respond, and actually quite a few people responded. Then the third category, called hours, with an H in parentheses, were basically hour-long periods that I set aside as often as possible, either by Skype or live in Toronto, where I'd put out a challenge and say, let's get together at this time. We're going to take some material from the piece, and together we'll shape something that will either literally end up in the final piece or will be a model that I can work with. So one example for that, for instance, was in October. I did a live session in the Toronto Symphony Hall with musicians from the Toronto Symphony Youth Orchestra, so age 14 to 18. And I took, at that point, I'd received many, many audio recordings from around Toronto, and I'd taken some of those recordings and made kind of audio collages that represented some different parts of Toronto. I took 5 of those and each one I played for the youth symphony, and I said, okay, first of all, let's listen to this and see if you can tell me where this sound collage comes from, what part of Toronto. So there was a subway, there was Chinatown on a Sunday morning, there was one of the beaches. Toronto has all these incredible beaches on the lake right in the center of town. There was a market there. Anyway, 5 places, a skateboard. Mm-hmm. So they listened, answered where they thought it was, and then I said, okay, now we're going to spend about 10 minutes on each. Listen once more to the recording of that place. Now we're going to throw away the recording, and together reproduce this just with your acoustic instruments. Okay, so that's the beach. First thing you hear are the waves. What's a good way to make those waves? Okay, double bass is great. Low tremolos, terrific. Let me hear. Okay, maybe a little more tasto, maybe farther away from the bridge, a little lighter stroke. How many? 4 basses? That sounds great. So we went back and forth for all of these, and with each in about 10 minutes, we'd reproduced the audio really quite remarkably. The musicians, as often with orchestra musicians, these young people were fabulous players, never had been asked to do anything in that way, so they were thrilled. And it led to a lot of orchestration ideas for transcribing the real sounds of Toronto into acoustic music that I did end up using in the piece. We launched the piece in June, and by about November, many ways for people to contribute. 2 other ways that come to mind are we have some software at the Media Lab called Hyperscore, which is a package that uses lines and color, originally designed for children, but allows anybody to make original music, which transcribes automatically into instrumental music. So over the summer, I worked with teachers from the Toronto School Board all around the city, and we made a curriculum for the fall to invite kids, 3rd to 6th graders, to work with Hyperscore, to think about composing in general, and then to write material and pieces related to the Toronto Symphony project. So starting in September, we had quite a few, several thousand kids from around the city who participated in this project and wrote little fragments or pieces with some idea of Toronto in mind, everything from the harbor front to traffic to my backyard at night, which scares the heck out of me, to all kinds of really amazing things. And we brought all those kids together in December, had a concert where we played about 15 of the pieces, and then I took all of those and thought about how to use them. There's a movement at the piece called City Music, which incorporates some of those pieces with my connecting material. And then, beginning of December, we launched 3 totally new apps. One kind of idea score, and the other is called Constellation. And by that time, I did a lot of material for the piece itself. And we put that material back into these apps and let people either change the structure of movements. So, for instance, I put out the finale for the piece when I had the basic material that I hadn't written before, and said, here's an app which will let you decide on how long it is and, what the repeats are like and how it develops and what the accompaniment is. There was another one that took the movement that has the main melody for the piece and allowed people basically to orchestrate it using the app. And a third one called Constellation, which takes many, many audio fragments that were either recorded or were played by the orchestra to make textures which can be used as accompaniment textures throughout the piece. So those are a variety of things. None of this, it was all very difficult to do. None of it would have worked if I hadn't started out with a kind of graphic. There was a graphic score of what I thought the final piece would look and feel like. So it's like a kind of logo.
Architecture?
Say again?
Was it kind of like an overall architecture?
Yeah, it's kind of a formal architecture, but it's because it has color and texture. So, and already when we launched this at the beginning of the summer, it was already divided into sections, and the sections were movements, and each movement was tagged with this yours, mine, or ours idea, so that where the material was going to come from in each section, a kind of feeling of which sections were contrapuntal, which sections were sort of rhythmically synchronized, which were building, which were kind of more gentle. And as often happens in projects like these, I launched that at the beginning because it had a kind of, it was a concept that I believed in. It was sort of like coming into a city that you don't know, having impressions of the city really overwhelm you or me, spending some time thinking about, reflecting on what the experience was, and then putting things together. This kind of a big three movement like that. And, a lot of things have been adjusted in composing the piece. I made sure that for a project like this, I didn't want everything to be fixed before I invited the public in. I thought that wouldn't feel right. But overall structure now is, quite similar to that graphic that I sent out in June, which is kind of nice. It's been, the exact order of things changed and the proportions have changed, but the stories remained the same, and the kind of relationships between what I'm doing and what the public has done have stayed close to my concept. And I think having that at the beginning allowed people to understand what the framework was.
It's really interesting when you describe the process of putting this piece together. A lot of what you were saying reminded me of how you were describing the Media Lab earlier, this collaboration from all these different fields and the kind of iteration that was happening. It was an interesting connection between those two things. And one of the go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I think you're right about that, and I think I may have been drawn to the Media Lab originally because I like this kind of process, but certainly I tried this project probably because of my experience over the years at the Media Lab. And one experience, it's funny when you sit in a studio like this, when you sit in your home studio and let's say you're writing a piano piece or an orchestra piece. When I started out composing, when I was at Juilliard, let's say, one of the reasons I was attracted to composing in the beginning was the ability to have this world in your own mind that you're trying to create, and the ability to spend a week or a year working out all of the details and making that world real without ever having to explain it to anybody or verbalizing it or really sharing it until it's ready. And paradoxically, over the years, maybe partly because of the work I do with technology, the work that often involves many other people, certainly Toronto Symphony is a perfect example. This is a project where, I made this graphic, I articulated a process, I talked about the piece before I had any idea what it was going to sound like or any idea what the melodies or harmonies were. It was very scary. It's not really a fun thing to do, and it was quite extreme in this case because I did that for a whole city, and then we had to socialize and publicize the project early on because we had to get people interested. We had to get them involved. So it was a very strange process, and it's not one that I find comfortable, but I thought it was important to do. And actually, one quick thing I want to say is there are many surprises in this project. You asked ago what some of the surprises were, but one big surprise for this project is that, again, being a tech guy and from the Media Lab, I thought that the possible tool for getting the word out and for getting people excited and for actually having people participate was going to be, through our blog, through Skype, through all the different web activities. I thought 95% of the participation would be online. And we started getting people interested in May, beginning of June. And people started responding, but I started noticing that a large number of people responding were the Toronto Symphony. It was kind of a fairly insular group. It wasn't breaking out of the channels that I was hoping to reach. So we actually brought somebody onto the project based in Toronto who ran a community music organization, somebody who had a lot of experience just with who was in Toronto and what who was where and who were the community leaders and who were the music leaders. And it turns out that over the summer and then all the way through, I spent an enormous amount of time going to Toronto, setting up meetings with people to find out what interested them, what kind of musical collaboration would get them excited, what kind of workshop, what kind of activity we could set up that would be interesting. So I would say maybe not 95, but like certainly 60 or 65% of the activity was actually meeting people face to face.
Wow.
And
wow.
You're part of a community. Let's bring this group together now and that group. And it kind of, that was actually really exciting. I never expected it, but I met a lot of people. It was quite.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds something I preach about in the educational contexts I've found myself in is that the new communication technologies don't necessarily create contacts. They allow you to articulate your contact with that person or those groups in different ways and facilitate speed, but sometimes you need boots on the ground at least to get things started, face-to-face contact. I was wondering if there were, in all this interaction with people, were there any decisions, sort of composerly decisions that you were led to that surprised you, like something that went against sort of like the grand scheme, or something that you had sort of, whether you realized it or not, had set in your mind, and then after the collaboration process really got rolling, that you were convinced to change?
Great question. Let's see. I think there probably are a lot of things. Well, let me think about that. I think that I think one thing that maybe didn't change so much was absolute overall shape. I think I had this notion from the very look. I had two notions from the very beginning. One was what for this kind of drama of coming into a city which I kind of knew but didn't really know, getting to know it and its people and being barraged with material to take into account, needing a kind of part of the piece to absorb that, and then wanting a part of the piece to put that together. That general structure remained. Exactly what material where changed a great deal depending on what started coming to me. So, for instance, richness of audio that people were recording, the video, that city, the imagination that people showed in what to record, it just blew me away. I mean, I've always been interested in natural sound and the relationship between natural sound and music and the continuity. I wrote an opera a few years ago called Skellig, which had a lot to do with listening. The story had a lot to do with listening and how if you listen carefully to the world around you, there's much more there than you expect. But in this project, I really ended up listening to people's recordings, and then I got a set of binaural headphones, binaural microphones that Patrick's wearing there. No, they're like earbud headphones, but they're extremely high quality microphones. Pick not only extremely accurate stereo, but they also pick up the resonance inside your ear cavities. So they're extremely realistic. And more than any other microphone I've seen, they pick up vertical up and down information. So
wow.
I would, and parts of Toronto that people had mentioned. And it's funny when you wear microphones like that in your ears, you've got the sound right here. And I just found myself listening to the city, and then I would come back here and stand in my meadow outside the barn, for instance, or walk around Boston. I found myself listening to so many more layers of sound, and the kind of physical position of the sound and the placement than I usually do. And that led to using maybe a longer section, using literal sounds of the city than I expected, and a range of orchestration techniques for going back and forth between the orchestra and these sounds, bringing out the musicality in these sounds. I think that section of the piece is not really like anything I've written before at all. And I don't know anything else exactly like it. It's not like John Cage, where it's sort of just a collage of sounds. It's not like Steve Reich, where you play a recorded sound enough times that the melody in that sound emerges. This is a huge amount of sounds going by, and I've tried to use the orchestra to pick out the musicality in the sound the first time you hear it. So it's kind of like the orchestra is giving auditory cues that make all these sounds musical, even though you hear them just for a fragment of a second. So I think that had a lot to do with what people sent me. The hyperscore pieces that the kids made completely blew me away. We've done workshops using hyperscore around the world for almost 10 years now. We've had wonderful experiences, but we've never had these workshops in the context of a larger project. They're usually, the larger context is usually we're going to put on a concert. The concert's hosted by a performing organization like a symphony orchestra or even a rock band. And the challenge to, let's say, the participants is you have this amount of time to write your original piece using this software. Musically, hyperscore is a great way to start with an idea and to grow that. We don't usually start with a theme. This project, where Toronto was the city, was something that everybody had in common. I took the central chords from the piece and the central melodies from the piece, translated those into hyperscore, made them available to kids. So that gave everybody a similar, even though we didn't say your piece has to be 30 seconds, 1 minute, 3 minutes, but it meant that I got back this incredible collection of pieces that all had a kind of, they had a great diversity, but also a family resemblance. So it gave me a collection of fantastic compositions by kids that I could introduce in my piece enough to show something really fantastic that somebody had done, and then to kind of pull them apart into fragments to use them as building blocks for that particular movement. So that's also a kind of structure that I've never done before. I've written pieces where maybe I might use a familiar piece from the repertoire that I reinterpret, but to use a piece written by a kid that nobody's heard before, to introduce it and to honor it so that you hear it and hear what's interesting about it, and then have it have some little characteristic bit of it become part of a compositional texture. That's a whole movement of the piece. Anyway, those are two things that come to mind.
So Todd, that's a lot about how you put the piece together. I was wondering if there's going to be any innovative ways of sharing the piece now that it's complete. I can't imagine that there's just going to be an orchestral performance and then boom, it's back to work and we're done with all this stuff.
Wow, that's a good question. So
it doesn't have percent like written in stone.
What?
It doesn't have to be written in stone. I'm sure you're still woodshedding ideas.
Well, yeah. So the things that are clear are that there are a variety of other people who are interested in projects like these. So the idea of building on this kind of collaboration and building on some of the techniques that we developed, that will definitely happen. So right away, I'm going to start work on another collaborative piece for the Edinburgh Festival for this coming summer for the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. And that one, because the time scale is shorter and because Edinburgh is far away, we're going to try to really push the online collaboration part. So, I don't have to, it's not possible to go spend that much time in Edinburgh. Plus, the interesting thing about Edinburgh is it's this kind of small city in the kind of out in the kind of far away from everything that becomes like the center of a lot of things when the festival happens. So what we'll do is put a call out to people around the world who have an interest in the Edinburgh Festival, either who've been there in the past, who are coming this summer. And so it'll be kind of, the piece is actually called Edinburgh Festival City. So it's about this contrast between the city and the festival. Anyway, there are a variety of other projects coming up. We're still, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is broadcasting Toronto Symphony. They'll broadcast it, I think, on April 21st. So they're recording it. That recording will be archived. In principle, it hasn't been confirmed yet because I think the Toronto Symphony is still raising the money. In principle, there's going to be the CBC has offered their feed to do a live stream of the concert on March 9th when it happens with all the visuals. Because one thing, when I started this project, my original idea was have no visuals at all because I wanted all of this material to come together and wanted it to be a purely musical experience. But you asked what kind of things changed over the course of the project. The more I realized how many people were contributing, how the story of what goes where and how it fits together, it's so important to get some of that or a lot of that while you're listening, that there's actually quite a sophisticated visual component during the piece. So with any luck, we'll be streaming the concert live with the visuals. Then there's a question of what rights we have to make it available in other ways at other times, and we're still working on that. I never thought of this, a Toronto Symphony project, as a musical composition that would be open-ended moving into the future. I thought of this process of pulling it together as being extremely collaborative, and then the result would be this piece which is going to be played and then hopefully played again. But the piece itself is meant to be a finished piece at the point that it's performed on March 9th. So for me, what goes on in the future is documentation about this piece, the ability to experience it, the tools that have been built and the experiments that have been made to allow this piece to exist, and then the ability to make other pieces like it.
Yeah. Well, just getting future performances that have an accompanying talk, that goes into the process and the technology involved, hopefully inspire other people to do the same. I was wondering, you mentioned visuals. Did you come up with all the visuals and put those together, or was that something that was sort of done collaboratively as well?
Yeah, the visuals, one of my students, a PhD student named Peter Torpe, is a very close collaborator, and he's somebody with a background in graphics and software and theater and also in music. And he's probably been my closest single collaborator on this project. So he has been making a lot of the visuals. I mean, I work closely with him, but he's designing the visuals. So he's putting together the whole, 30-minute visuals that will go along with the performance. We talk all the time about it, but the graphics and the editing, it's quite a sophisticated system. That's all his.
Cool.
One thing that surprises me, and maybe it's just because I've never worked like this, but listening to you talk about this piece is how much control you give up. I feel like, studying to be a composer, we're always taught, how to get as much control as you can and kind of work as this autonomous, this autonomous king of your score. And maybe if you absolutely must collaborate with performers, and it seems like it just surprises me how much control you've given up, and the tools that you use to collaborate with people, things like Hyperscore and these very interesting web apps that you put together. One thing that surprised me was how interesting the sounds that you could make with them are, especially something like Hyperscore that you say is so geared toward young kids. I feel like a lot of the applications that I see people using to teach kind of composition and musical creativity are designed so that you can't make anything that sounds too weird with them. Like the worst you can come up with is like a pentatonic mishmash that can't ever really sound that bad, and everything made with them ends up sounding like, the demo program on a Casio keyboard at Toys R Us. And the things that were made with Hyperscore, and you posted a few of these to the project blog, struck me as being really compelling pieces of sound, like really just really compelling little bits of music. And I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on the extent to which you cede control to your collaborators in this project.
Yeah, so there are really two questions there. One is kind of a bigger one about the different kinds of collaboration, and the other is something about the kind of tools or the structure that you make available, right. What kind of openness or flow. Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the tools. That's a little more specific. And I totally agree with you. You know, one of the things I spend a lot of time doing, and not something I trained for or expected to be doing, but turns out to be something I'm pretty good at, is how to design an environment that creates the kind of interaction and the kind of collaboration that you want, because it's not the same for every situation. In general, I don't believe in the kind of limited system that you described a minute ago. So, you know, if you're going to give somebody a tool to make something, you don't want to do something that's so constrained that only a small, you know, like a pentatonic scale, or only things that are in the C major scale, you know, only things that are quantized so that rhythmically it's, you know, bop bop bop. I mean, if it's too restricted, it's not just that the result's not going to be that interesting. The bigger problem is that anybody using it, people aren't stupid. Anybody using it is going to say, well, that's not mine. I mean, I couldn't put my personal stamp on it. That's the software. That's the system. You know, people just won't like it. It's not interesting enough. If something's completely open, you know, a piano is constrained because you only have 88 notes and there are only white keys or black keys. But a piano is actually quite hard to play, you know, if you don't have the technique and if you don't know which notes go together. You know, cats can play a piano. And actually, there are a couple of really good YouTube videos of dogs playing piano. I saw one the other day. Did you see that one? The little dog that bashes the piano and sings at the same time? So, you know, he's pretty good. But generally, a piano is an example of a very elegant, simple-to-play instrument that's actually extremely hard to make real music out of, because there are all kinds of things you have to learn. So how do you make an environment that technically isn't that hard, but conceptually has a lot of richness to it? And there are a lot of different ways. Something like Hyperscore, the interface is very easy. Anybody can draw a line. Anybody can figure out, you know, there aren't that many different things in Hyperscore. There are little windows where you make motives. They're either melodies or harmonies or rhythms. And then each one of those gets a color and you draw with those. You can learn the rules of Hyperscore very quickly, but it doesn't have any restriction as to which collection of notes or which collections of rhythm. You can put together anything you want. So it's actually quite an open environment, and it's one that leads to, it's funny, Hyperscore doesn't work so well for a very experienced composer who has a really clear idea in mind already. It's not the thing I would to transcribe a specific idea I have in my mind. It's a very good environment to use to make a sketch, to take a bit of an idea and to try to follow it and have it grow. And that tends to be something that novices can do. So anyway, I think it's a real art to design tools which are simple and allow people in, but are open and allow you to be individual. And we spend a lot of time trying to design those. In terms of collaboration, there's such a wide range. I think for me, working on operas, which I liked, you know, I started doing about 20 years ago, I bringing all the different senses and artistic modes together into a, you know, I like things that have a story, enough of a story to your emotional experience. When you work on an opera, you have to find your own style of collaboration that works, because there's no other way to make a piece like that that involves so many other different I've had good collaborations and bad collaborations, and, you know, ones of every color, and so I've learned a lot from that environment and from the Media Lab. And some projects are wonderful to do collaboratively, and others aren't. And this Toronto Symphony has been great, and it's pushed things in a different direction for me.
One thing that I thought was really interesting of the three web apps that you put together for this, my favorite, and I guess maybe it was the first one, was Media Score, the City Soaring version of media score, where you've composed these kind of voices, these layers, and you're giving people control over like the timeline of those, and it's a really interesting way to represent time visually. You know, when I look at something that purports to be a description of sound or music in two axes, I assume that the horizontal axis is sound and the vertical axis is either pitch or volume. And this was just a really interesting idea to use the vertical axis to be like the point in a sample or something.
I see. I think you're talking about the Toronto dances, not City Soaring.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
yeah.
You're absolutely right.
And that was the first one. You're absolutely right. And that is somewhat different. You're right, because I wanted people to, I put out about 30 seconds of the kind of core material from the finale, which is a big dance where everything becomes synchronized. It's kind of meter-wise, it's very complex, but it's dum bum 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 like that. And you're right. When you open up the app, there's a diagonal line that goes from the bottom left to the top right, and that's the fragment that I put in there. If you don't perturb the time, it's exactly what you said. And we came up with this kind of odd notion that if you bend that diagonal line, you're actually bending time, and you're not bending time by going faster and slower, which is the way we usually think of it. You know, da 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 da. You're actually skipping back and forth. It's like it's kind of like looping, but you're looping structurally, and you're taking a fragment here, a fragment there, and stitching them together, and you can repeat something. So you're actually building structure by changing time with this line. And that one, I actually listened to everything that people sent me, and I did introduce that to the public before I had written the final version of Toronto Dances. And there were all kinds of interesting things that came back, and a variety from kind of repeating things over and over again to building tension to things that lasted 10 minutes long to things that expressed everything in 30 seconds, 15 seconds. And I thought about all that, thought about my own ideas, and wrote my version of the coda, which is about 2.5 minutes. It kind of takes both extremes and works them together. It kind of builds with the basic material, repeats, goes back to the beginning, builds some more, goes back to the beginning, goes into kind of E section where I took a little fragment that I hadn't thought of as being kind of one of the main motivic units for that section, and I expanded. I take out the bass line and change it. I actually brought back a lot of the harmony from my original chords and have a kind of section where it goes wild harmonically, and then it goes back and builds and builds and builds. So I was really grateful to get versions that people made with that and incorporated them in some way into my final version.
So, Dave, do we have some audio we can listen to?
Well,
say again?
Patrick was just asking so I've got you sent us some audio samples, and I'm wondering what part of this do you think would be good to play to give people a little idea of what we're talking about?
Let's see. I think you got frozen there. I know what you're trying to do.
We've got some audio samples that you sent us. Thank you for sending those. And I was trying to figure out which one of these I think would be a good thing to play to give people an idea of what we're talking about, so it's not quite so abstract.
Yeah. So well, let's see. I think they're all interesting in their own way. There's one. Let's see. There's one that has some samples from the city and instrumentation, I think. Maybe it's the second one. There's one that goes between recordings of the city, just with a recording, and then there's a second version, which is the musicians from the Youth Symphony.
Let's play that one. I think those are a really interesting pair. So first you're going to hear samples and then you're going to hear the musicians from the orchestra mimicking those samples, right?
That's right. So this is one of the beaches in Toronto. It's a collage that I made. Maybe you can spin that one. That's the first of those.
Yeah, here it is. So here's first we're gonna hear the samples recorded from the beach, and then the orchestra.
Those wacky clarinets.
Yeah, you would be forgiven, I think, for not catching that switch over between the samples and the orchestra sounds.
That was very close. Can I ask you? Did you write it in a notationally for a sliding high on cellos?
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned before, the fun thing about that is that we made that translation live. So in front of an audience, we played the original, and then we worked for about 10 or 15 minutes to, with no notation at all, to talk to each section to decide, how to do the water, how to do the seagulls, how to do the cicadas that come in, and then I notated it afterwards.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's so many different kinds of processes and such a path this piece has taken. It's pretty incredible. I was wondering if these all these different apps and all these tools, like, I know that I might try this with an ensemble now of taking an audio recording and working it out with them and trying to generate some notation from that, transcribing what they might choose. So that's a tool that I can take away and use in my own, and with attribution. I really thank you for that. I was wondering if all these other applications, the web apps, if you've built them in a way that you might open them up for people to use for their own projects as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think probably step number one is, it's now Sunday, February 24th. The piece is premiered in 2 weeks from now. So I'm still, I only say that because I'm still in crunch mode, getting all the production elements together for the final performance. I mean, the score is done, thank God, but there's still a fair amount of work to do just to get ready for rehearsals. But what I'll do as soon as this is over is to step back a little bit and just think about the apps and the different techniques objectively on, detached from this particular piece, to see what I think of them and to see how we want to tweak them to push them forward. And absolutely, like most of these kind of apps that I develop, I completely see them as things that I hope are useful to all kinds of people in a lot of different ways. And I hope also that the particular model of kind of inviting a group of people to come together for a collaborative project around a theme. I mean, I happen to like the city idea. There's something resonant about that. But there's certain things that I learned from the whole process that I'd like to just express in some way to make available to other people. One thing you were saying a second ago, Nate, is there's something interesting about this idea of going from live recordings to acoustic sound. I know in doing all this listening to the real environment for myself and thinking about it instrumentally, I've done a variety of things like that over the years, but nothing as intensively as this. And it's opened up huge areas for me about thinking about orchestration and thinking about layering and the relationship between the nuance and flexibility and complexity of natural sound and what we can do with instruments. And that's a place where I'd love to have some kind of set of tools to help me not to do an automatic translation, but somehow to help me work with large numbers of instruments in a much more flexible, subtle way than anything I know. Something that might be more visual and more painterly than any interface I know. It's opened up some musical ideas and some orchestration ideas and some ideas for technology and apps that I'd like to see that don't exist, which means we'll probably end up spending a year trying to build them.
Yeah, I love that. I've often fantasized of kinds of drawing note, like a whole music notation interface where you can also just literally draw on it and really just blur those lines, and playing with different kinds of interfaces and working in that world is something that's been interesting to me for a long time. And so I've been keeping an eye on your media lab for a long time, and
That's that's one thing that doesn't happen all that much. Maybe we should find a better way to do that. Is to make it easier for people to come forward with problems they're trying to solve, or tools that might be useful, or just images of things that are compelling to them that maybe we haven't thought of. We follow our own intuitions on these, and it's kind of haphazard who we come in contact with who has interesting things they're trying to solve. So anyway, that's a takeaway I'll think about, is how to make it easier for people to share ideas with us.
Interesting.
Well, making it easier for people to share ideas with you makes me think about something I've been itching to get to this point, the whole interview. I think it would be fair to say that you have an interest in figuring out how to democratize the creation of music, to enable access both to experience and creation for people who are not experts. I think HyperScore is a terrific tool in that capacity. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts about that and its place in, does it have a place in music education? Like, should we be teaching people how to enable that kind of thing in their communities and with their students?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And you're absolutely right that that's a fundamental concern of mine. I think that maybe an even more significant concern of mine is how to connect the kind of participation that I think is necessary and important that everybody have with sophisticated music making, and excellence and expertise. So it's one thing to say that it's fantastic for everybody to participate, and that we, there's a kind of access that everybody could and should have that's not easily available. But I think the real trick for the next generation is how to create the kind of communication and collaboration between people with a lot of experience and people with a lot of love who care about something but maybe don't have the experience, so that things are democratic, but they're also really, really good, that the experience is deep, and that everybody's experience goes up. One of the reasons for doing something like a Toronto Symphony is that I think a lot of the inhibitions about participating in music have sort of faded away. Like I have a 15-year-old daughter, and she's very, she happens to be talented musically, so she does a lot of cool things. But she and her friends, when they hear a new piece of music, they'll listen to the original, whether it's by Lady Gaga or by David Little or whoever it's by. They'll listen to the original once, and then they'll start making their own version. And what gets passed around are hundreds and hundreds of thousands and thousands of individual versions of something that's interested somebody, and almost nobody goes back to the original version anymore. They'll share each other's stuff, and so sharing things that's getting more common. What doesn't happen is nobody really has the possibility of going back to Lady Gaga or going back to David Little or going back to Bjork or anybody and saying, I had this idea. You should really think about it for your next piece. Or, you're in the studio right now. Let's spend a little time talking about what you're doing and what, most artists don't have time for that. And most people, it's not, for all the reasons we talked about before, it's a very uncomfortable thing to let people into your creative process. But I think if we do that, it's not something that creative artists want to do all the time. But if you say, what should we be teaching in school? I teaching that to be an artist in the future is a much different kind of collaboration with whoever else is out there, whether it's your colleagues that you want to share things with, whether it's your audience, whether it's you're the creative musician, and then there are people realizing your work. I think there's a much different kind of back and forth, which is enriching for everybody. It's certainly enriching for the audience, who instead of just receiving something once it's finished, I think there are all kinds of different roles that somebody can have in helping to shape something at performance time,
Definitely.
at rehearsal, at just understanding time or creation time. And I think as creators, one of our responsibilities is to help propose these kind of models. And as educators, I think it's incredibly important to teach our young artists that there's a different way of thinking about these things going forward. And it's much further than just it's wonderful to go out and mentor and just work with the general public, things you are passionately in itself. But I think there's a much more dynamic model that we need to invent and then get to our young artists and get out into the world. And it will happen. And I hope, my team and I can have a little bit of influence for, showing some possible positive ways that it could happen.
That's interesting. I'm thinking of like an artistic version of GitHub, where you can have your project that's open to everybody, and then they can push changes, and you can have the person that is kind of there's like a project manager that's making those decisions as to what gets put. And you have nightlies for the symphony.
No, I think it really could be, and I think the real key is the thing I've been grappling with this project, which is how do you set up the communication? The extreme case is between sort of one creative director, leader, and a lot of collaborators, but it's equally true. What's the future of different kind of communication between a group of kind of equal collaborators? I mean, one thing we did with the opera Death and the Powers is the early stage of media scores was a software environment that let myself and Diane Paulus, the theatrical director, and Carol Armitage, the choreographer, and Alex McDowell, the production designer, and many other people all trade ideas in the same environment. It let us all, let's say, have curves that we could draw that would show the overall emotional shape that would apply to the images and to the color and to the music and the orchestration and the narrative all at the same time. So I think there are all kinds of forms of collaboration that combine democracy of different people working together and having a voice, and excellence, which is at the end of the day what we're looking for are experiences that deeply change our lives. Otherwise, why would we do any of this? That's the real challenge. And we've got, there's a long way to go to make this work right. But it's exciting because I think, we can at least talk about it now, and it doesn't sound completely crazy. And we can make like a Toronto Symphony that may not be perfect, but show one model of how this might work, and hopefully it'll get people talking. Maybe six.
I think that's the key. It's one model. I think having people educated in like the various technologies and the way that there's not like there's a way to do it. It's you have the ability to do all these different kinds of things, and you need to intelligently pick what you're going to do for this project. So I have a great suggestion for your post Toronto Symphony project. a course pack for state composition programs to force graduate students to do a community collaboration composition project as a part of their curriculum. And just a course pack that's like a guidance thing on how they might go about that. I think that would be fantastic.
I think you're right. I think it's really interesting. I'm a visiting professor of composition at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and for some reason, I don't know. It's a very interesting time in the UK. I think this last generation, it's probably the best place I know right now where the kind of feeling of artistic excellence and public involvement has been nurtured naturally in a better way than most other places. So when I go there and I talk to like master students in composition about new ways of, the new kind of responsibility of the role of being a young composer, people get it there quicker than other places. So, but I think there's hope, and I love your idea of writing into the state curricula. Great. I think I don't know what your plan is, but I think I've pretty much soon got to go back to actually finish this thing. I've got to get back to work.
Yeah, we have to get out of here too. But thank you so much for joining us. We're gonna at the end of the episode. Normally, we would play a longer excerpt of a piece and recommend to all of our audience to check out the whole thing. And we're going to play a little bit of Sparkler at the end. So maybe you just want to say a little bit about Sparkler before you go?
I'd love to. So Sparkler was written in 2001. It was commissioned by the American Composers Orchestra. And it was always imagined as a kind of overture. So it often ends up on the beginning of a program. And I thought of it as a kind of, it was part of a project called Toy Symphony, which was the project where we launched Hyperscore, actually. And it was a project to bring kids and symphony orchestras together. And I thought of Sparkler as a kind of, almost like Benjamin Britten's Young People's Guide to the Orchestra, as a sort of young people's guide to the orchestra and technology. That's kind of a silly way of thinking about it. But it's kind of true. It's a rather short piece. And it's for large orchestra with a lot of technology, both kind of accompanying the orchestra, and then it has a kind of cadenza section where I build these things called hyper instruments, where a virtuosic musician, depending on the way he or she plays an instrument, the technology follows the way the instrument's played. It follows the music, but also the gesture, and then the electronics respond and kind of naturally become part of the instrument. In Sparkler, about 10 minutes into the piece, from about minute 10 to minute 13, I turn the whole orchestra into a hyper orchestra. And everybody's playing acoustic instruments, but we have microphones, not that many, about 6 to 8 microphones around the orchestra, pulling in the audio. And just through the audio, the software can tell how the orchestra is playing. It can tell the notes, it can tell loud or soft, it can tell the quality of sound. And based on that, the electronics adapt live to the orchestra. And in that same section, the conductor has a huge amount of freedom for how to shape the orchestra. He or she can pull out different sections, can do forzando, can change the timbre quite a bit. And so by morphing the orchestra sound, the electronics follow. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I talked before about bringing in many fragments of audience of Toronto into a Toronto Symphony. In Sparkler, partly because it's kind of a playful piece for young people, I took the theme to the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and also a lot of fragments of Beatles tunes, very, very short fragments that turn up everywhere in Sparkler. So it's a kind of kaleidoscope with a new sound for the orchestra based on a lot of material that you might recognize if you listen really carefully.
Well, that is very cool. I'm sorry we didn't get more time to talk to you about it. But thank you so much for giving us your time. We're big fans. If I may speak personally, I'm very inspired by all the projects that you do at the MIT Media Lab. And I'm sorry we didn't get more time to talk about. I mean, we could talk for hours more about Death and the Powers and the hyper instruments and all those other great projects. But thank you so much.
We'll cover that
for
stuff the
giving
next
us
time
your time.
you're on.
Yeah, next time you're on, we'll talk about Death and the Powers and hyper instruments. Thank you so much for being with us, Tod.
Thanks so much for having me, and hope indeed to talk again soon.
All right.
Sounds
Anytime you've got a cool project, like I assume all of your projects are as cool as the Toronto Symphony. Next time you've got something like that going on, just shoot us an email. We'd love to have you on to talk about it.
Well, I will let you know.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll find you, and it's okay.
We'll find you. So thank you. Sorry?
I just said thanks a lot.
Oh.
See you soon.
Go
You're
get
quite
to work.
welcome. Yes. Get to work. We'll be very curious to see this last little bit. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us this week for the show live in chat. We do this show usually at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're a little off schedule this week. We'll be back next week with our guest. Is Andy Lee our guest next week? Am I remembering that
That's
correctly? Right. Pianist Andy Lee will join us. We'll talk about a very interesting project that he has, reclaiming a piece from kind of the early proto-minimalist repertoire kind of reconstructed by Kyle Gann, big recording project and concert he's got going. So look forward to that next week. Again, that'll be at 11 a.m. Eastern Time next Sunday. If you are not able to watch this show live, of course, you can always download archived episodes at soundnotion.tv/SN. You can also leave us a comment there. We'd love to continue this conversation about collaboration and about music and technology and community engagement there on our site, or also on Facebook or Twitter. As a group, we're at SoundNotion on Twitter. I'm at Dave McDowell. Patrick is at Fox Shibuya. Sam is at Housegoy. Nate is at Inatetree. And you can follow Todd in a number of places, but it's Opera of the Future program at MIT is at Opera Future. So you should follow all those people. And again, we'd love to interact with you in those places as well. You can subscribe to this show and all our shows at SoundNotion TV on the iTunes Store or anywhere else finer podcasts are available, and get every episode downloaded to your device each week. And that is totally free, so think about doing that. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Our video introduction is by Tyler Lepp, and our audio is by our own Patrick Gullo. So we're going to go out with a little excerpt from Tod Machover's Sparkler, and we will see you back next week.